Okay, I didn't realize it's been almost 2 weeks since I've done a video. The time got away from me a little bit. In the last video, I was talking about an article that I wanted to bring up as kind of a topic to touch upon. And I had never heard of the lady until I saw this article. I started to research her a little bit. She's actually got a whole gigantic volume of information that challenges the disease theory of addiction, which oddly enough I found out by reading about some of her stuff in her TED Talks and a couple of other things. I haven't had a lot of time to go in depth with it, but there's a lot of neuroscientists and a lot of other professionals who agree that addiction is not a disease, but there's a reason I actually wanted to talk about this. She's got a new book out. It's called Unbroken Brain, where she says in this magazine article, I'll post a link to it in the video thing in the bottom there, but she says that addiction is not a disease, and she goes a little bit into her own background about, her own addictive problems and going into AA and all of that, and she goes more in depth about why the disease theory is actually harming people. As a matter of fact, she has one YouTube video I watched not too long ago, and it was saying if addiction is a disease, then why is it treated as something criminal? Why are people punished for having it? But the one thing that I noticed on all the articles and all the talks, even where other scientists or other people are saying, addiction is not really a disease, they talk about how it's referred to as a brain disease or a progressive brain disease, and they sort of turn that over on its head. But I noticed that nobody's really pointing out the really deeply embedded lunacy of AA and the way that it describes the disease. It seems to me like it's a popular thing because it's been repeated so much in our cultures, and because it's been said so many times. A lot of people, if you maybe stop them casually on the street and ask them a question, and you said, what's alcoholism or what's drug addiction, they might just absent-mindedly say, well, it's a disease, without really giving any forethought as to what disease means, and I think it's really difficult when talking to people who have never been in AA or never been exposed to the insanity of AA, to really convince them of what, because they haven't actually been inside of it. They haven't actually seen the insanity of the so-called fellowship. They haven't read the literature and how insane it all is. I remember I showed a couple of pages to a family member, one of the few family members I actually speak to, and I showed them a few pages out of the big book, and they were looking at it, and they were like, well, the word God is plastered all over every page. I mean, this is, and it has a very twisted idea, everything. And I guess the one thing I wanted to bring up is, even though, I agree totally it's not a disease, in my opinion, and apparently, I guess where she's coming from with this, I'll go into a little bit more detail about it in a second or two here. It's kind of a learned behavior, or so it was in my case. I mean, I was raised around drinking. I was raised around heavy drinking, and I started drinking at a fairly young age. I don't believe it's some genetic thing like that. I think it was, it's kind of an interesting, I guess, an interesting situation in my case, because it was the drinkers and the people that abused alcohol. I guess some of them, well, I won't say abused. I would say they drank it really heavily, leave it at that. They weren't doing like me, getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to drink vodka like I used to do. But there were people that drank really heavily, within my own family. And when I say it's an interesting situation, it was the stereotypical image that pops into everybody's mind when you talk about a heavy drinker in the household. You're seeing him as him or her as being, the really obnoxious, abusive, loser type that ruins everything, that's always going to jail, that's always losing jobs, it's always draining everybody dry. And it was actually right the opposite in my household. It seemed like in terms of like abuse, or in terms of the people who were mean-spirited, or in terms of people who were just absolutely horrifying people to be around in terms of emotional abuse. Those were the people that weren't the ones who drank. Those were actually the ones that I guess you would call them sober. I don't know if they stayed away from alcohol because of the religious convictions. I don't really think that was the case, because I think anybody who knows anything about the Catholic Church knows that, Catholics like to drink. As a matter of fact, in retrospect, I actually believe this anti-drinking people in my household growing up, they did it more out of a killjoy type of thing. They were really miserable people that I don't, maintain any contact with today, but they were the type of people that they were utterly miserable in life, and therefore they were determined that everybody else was going to be miserable like them. So in other words, I don't believe they were anti-drinking because of any real reason. I think that was just a convenient thing to jump upon to create a fight. If the people in my family who were heavy drinkers that they were always given such a hard time to hadn't been drinkers, it would have been something else. And that's about the best way I know to describe it. So, I mean, for me at a younger age, it seemed like the really good people that were the drinkers in my household. And I'm not saying that that's what caused me to necessarily get addicted, but I know that when I started drinking at a pretty young age, I remember, well, of course I remember how it made me feel, but I associated drinking with something pleasant. Drinking was there's nobody in AA that ever really wants to talk about that. They always want to make it sound like that from the moment they took the first one to the moment they took the last one, it was just, intolerable. It was horrifying, whatever. Drinking was pleasure for me for a lot of years. It relieved my stress. It relieved a lot of my anxieties, I guess you could say. It did a lot of good things for me. I had a lot of fun drinking. I don't really think about drinking these days. It's been a long time since I wanted to drink. I don't really dwell on why it got all out of control. I mean, I could go on and on about it and write you a fucking book, but I'm not going to do that after this video. I'm just saying that for a lot of years, drinking was pleasure. And it was pleasure to the point that even when it started bringing about negative consequences, I kept doing it. But to be perfectly honest, the pleasure of actually drinking alcohol, that never went away, because the more intolerable my own life got when I drank, it did exactly what I wanted it to do. It made me feel like all was right with the world for a little while, So I'm getting back to this article, and the lady's name is Maia Szalavitz. Forgive me if I'm saying your name wrong. I mean, I'm a freaking half a wise guy from the Jersey here, but it's Maia Szalavitz, and she says that in her own research, in her own professional opinion, it's more of a sign of addiction is more of a sign of a learning disorder than a disease. And when I first heard that, I kind of reacted like, learning disorder, I don't know about that. But she makes a good case for the way that that people who abuse alcohol can't necessarily learn from, the negative consequences of what they're doing, or drugs, or whatever it is. They keep returning to it ultimately. And the book she wrote about it, I haven't read it yet. I'm just commenting on what I've read online about it. Is called Unbroken Brain, implying that there's nothing wrong with us people. It's just we've developed unhealthy skills as to how to deal with life by, with abusing alcohol. She does point out some very critical factors about Quackaholics Anonymous, as I call them. And she does point out some interesting things that I'm glad that this is out in the public and more a part of the addiction conversation, like how the whole tough love thing, for instance, she kind of, almost knocked my microphone off. She kind of challenges that, it seemed always obvious to me that the more you abuse someone for having an addiction problem, the more you drive them into an addiction. People are already addicted because they feel alone, they feel miserable, they feel like there's nothing in life that they can actually cope with, and now you've got the family and the AA assholes that are going to treat you like garbage, and that they're shocked when people who are already addicted don't start self-destructing even more. I mean, it's almost a system doomed to failure. Now, it seems like I'm wandering way off the topic of what I wanted to talk about here, but what I wanted to tie together here is, like I said a few minutes ago, is that all these articles that I've been seeing that kind of, agree with her. I haven't read everything she's written, obviously, and I haven't heard all of her videos, but it seems like nobody mentions the definition that AA uses for the term disease. A lot of people might think of that as, well, like, it's a mental illness is probably what I'm going to guess a lot of the public. I'm going to guess that's what they're thinking when they hear someone say alcoholism is a disease. It's like a mental illness. There's probably the reason a lot of people don't buy that, even though they haven't thought about it, is because, they'll say, well, you actually choose to do that. Therefore, it necessarily couldn't be a mental illness. I'm not going to get into the debate on that because that's kind of straying off topic from what I really want to focus on here. They might say, in terms of illness, well, maybe, you're damaged physically by alcohol abuse and therefore your brain and body can't process it any longer, which is actually a reality. I mean, there's some people with damaged livers that their body can't take alcohol. They can drink a little and they're intoxicated and they're plastered. And I think the general public might even have that idea when you hear the word disease. But what needs to be stressed more freely, I think, and what needs to be exposed more, in my opinion, is when AA is talking about a disease, okay, they're saying that it's a spiritual disease. Now, the word spiritual, by and large, when you put it out there into the public sphere like that, it sounds rather benign. It doesn't sound like the fundamentalist fanatical cult that AA really is. If someone said, I'm spiritually damaged by all I've done, I mean, they might think that you're speaking almost in a poetic way about how your addiction has ruined your life or anything. I think that I don't see enough in the discussion that cuts to the core of what AA is preaching when it says it's a disease. I mean, even the experts I see that are talking about, alcoholism's not really a brain disease, I don't think they realize what AA defines as a disease. AA is saying, okay, that you're born spiritually and mentally defective, and that the only way you can possibly be healed from this affliction or this illness is for it to be removed by God, by a higher power, including a doorknob or a tile or whatever higher power. They'll say the higher power could even be the group. It's just a group of drunks. But what they're ultimately saying is that it's a religious disease. Okay, it's right up there with faith healing. All right, a lot of people on the surface that I've talked to that really don't understand the insidious poison that is Alcoholics Anonymous. They think that, they might see a word or two out of the steps and they might think, well, this is about, focusing on, being more positive or being more calm or not being as stressed as much so you won't want to drink. And the organization is just an organization of people who get together and they discuss their problems and they, kind of bounce their stress off one another and, that it helps them get through drinking. But that's not what's going on in AA at all when it talks about a disease. I mean, when you actually sit down, and I mean, most people aren't going to go to the library or whatever and try to read the whole entire AA book, but I'm just telling you, the thing that's drilled into your head over and over when you're in AA is that you yourself are totally defective and deficient as a human being, okay, that you're incapable of doing anything good, that you're incapable of making any rational decisions, that you can't even be remotely functioning as a human being without a higher power and the group and your sponsor controlling every aspect of your life, including your thinking, forever. If you ask an average Joe on the street, something about AA, they might say, well, one day at a time or something like that, because you hear it in fucking movies and you hear it in TV series and all this other shit. But it's not at all a situation where you've got a group of people that are just trying to overcome their habit. I mean, if you get to reading the actual text of the AA book, it's all about converting you to a religion. Okay, it tells you that your real purpose is to serve God, that your real purpose is to be of maximum benefit to everyone. Now that sounds innocuous until you look within the context of what they're talking about. They're saying that you should spend all your time trying to recruit more people into the cult. That's what they call service work. That's what they call being of service. Being of service, to an untrained ear that has never been wrapped up into that bullshit might think being of service means being a good dad or being a good employee or being, or just, being a responsible person or whatever. That's not what it means at all. It means that you yourself cannot trust your own thinking processes. You can't trust yourself. You can't have faith in yourself. You can't have empowerment in yourself. You can't believe in yourself because you're so horrible as an addict that you need God to run everything. And then, and God rewards you with not drinking as long as you do His will being going to meetings and recruiting more people. Now, the funny thing about that is, as a person, if you heard something about being of maximum service to your fellows, you would think that means being responsible. That means being, I don't know, whatever your subjective interpretation is to the word good. That's not what they're talking about in AA. I mean, in AA, you could be a rapist, you could be a drug dealer, you could be a criminal who goes around assaulting people, you could be any kind of scumbag on earth that you want to be, but as long as you haven't had a drink in 10 years, you're beyond having done anything wrong. I think the medical community or the scientific community or just anybody in general who's going to talk about challenging the disease notion of AA needs to bring more out into the open the fact that, there's not a single disease I know of medically or scientifically that requires faith healing and spiritual experiences and miracles on demand in order for you who is afflicted with it, to get well. I don't know of anybody who's got, let's just say, schizophrenia, or they got depression, or they got OCD like I do. The medication helps me with it, but I mean, I've got OCD, and by the way, that is a real physical thing. There's a book called Brain Lock where you can look at people's brains who have OCD under CAT scans, and it behaves differently. I'm not saying that it's mentally and bodily different from your fellows or any bullshit that Quackaholics Anonymous preaches, but I'm saying there are neurological causes for certain, for certain mental illnesses. And I don't think that any psychiatrist in his right mind would say, well, the answer to your problem is to pray and to turn it all over to your higher power and to let your higher power run your life. And, a lot of people, I guess because, the public persona about, turning things over to God and all that other stuff, a lot of religious people in the outside world would interpret that as meaning, being close to your faith or, doing whatever within your own faith or practicing your faith. But that's not what AA does at all. AA tells you that it knows more than any religion does. It tells you that it knows more than any faith does. It tells you that your own faith couldn't save you because you were a drunk before you got to AA, so therefore religion's useless. They're not a pro-religious, pro-spiritual, pro-anything other than pro-cult religion. They're not for you getting well on your own through whatever faith you choose or whatever faith you might find peace with. In other words, as long as it lines up with a dogma. And I don't know of any major world religion that I can think of in depth that says that you can't do anything in life in terms of making a decision, in terms of doing anything, in terms of choice or choosing or anything else, that you're totally helpless when it comes to choice. You have to have God make the decision for you. In other words, God has to drive your car to work. God has to direct your thinking so that you know that you're not supposed to beat your fucking children or something like that. I mean, it's slavery is what AA is. But I think that the public conversation needs to turn more to the fact that when AA talks about progressive brain disease, okay, they wrap up a little phony medical bullshit in the doctor's opinion, or they throw you a little half-ass bunk psychology in the doctor's opinion. But if you read the entire text all the way through, what they're really saying is you have to have faith healing in order to get better. As a matter of fact, nothing is more evident than the fact that they'll say things like, by the grace of God, when someone else dies. What they're saying is that God chose them, okay, to get sober when he let somebody else die because, I don't know, they weren't praying to God in the right manner. Okay, I mean, it's really that ludicrous. I'm probably going to be looking up some more information about this as far as what Maia is talking about in this article. I mean, look, I appreciate the fact that there's more people in the news. In the news media, I guess you could say, that's kind of trying to turn the topic of conversation, the public conversation, away from this disease idea. But I hate it when I hear the word disease or disease theory. In order to have a theory, you have to have a whole lot of evidence that supports the theory. I mean, maybe it's a pet peeve of mine. I don't know what it is, but whenever I hear someone say, well, it's a theory has to have actual observable, empirical evidence that supports the theory in order for it to be a sound theory. If you say something like the world is flat and that's just a theory, just like the world is round, that's a theory, that's not a fucking theory, that's a hypothesis. You don't have any physical evidence to prove to me that the world is flat. I have actual physical evidence to prove to you that the world is round. So it kills me how sometimes religious fundamentalist fanatic nutcases will throw that word around like theory when they don't understand the word theory at all. It's not a theory when it comes to alcoholism being a disease. There's no way that you can put it under a microscope and prove that the only way for someone to break the cycle of their addictive behavior is for them to use faith healing and surrender their will to the faith healing for the rest of their lives. So I think that's about all I want to add on that one. I think I was becoming a little bit repetitive there, but I may do more on this topic because I haven't actually read everything she's talking about in terms of learning disorder, but I kind of... some people had the same initial reaction I did when they heard the word learning disorder. Well, wait a minute. But in Maia's case, I know she talks about having an undiagnosed autism spectrum disorder and that she used, liquor to treat it. And I kind of wonder, in my case, I had really bad OCD and anxiety. Liquor was literally my medication to treat it. So, I mean, when you say learning disorder, it's not necessarily in the immediate pop culture reference you might think to the term learning disorder. It's actually just saying that addiction, as people with addictions behave, they behave like someone more with a learning disorder than someone who's got a moral failing or some weird, phony, pseudo-spiritual affliction. Anyway, I'm going to try to make it next week. Sometimes I make it, sometimes I don't. I don't know. But that's all there is for now. Until next time.